Hello everyone, welcome back to Anupam Tech Talk. This is episode number 24, and today I want to talk about something we probably do dozens of times every day without thinking about what happens behind the scenes. We open a browser, type a URL, press enter, and within a few moments, a web page appears. But what actually happens between pressing enter and seeing that web page? Today, let's take that simple action and follow the complete journey from the URL all the way to web page. Let's start with the big picture, the complete journey. There are several important steps involved. First, the browser understands the URL, then DNS helps find the server, a secure connection is established. The browser sends the HTTPS request. The server processes that request and sends response back. And finally, the browser processes that response and renders the web page. So, by the end of this video, we will understand each of these step. Let's start with the first one, the URL itself. The browser understands the URL. Let's take a simple example. Let's say we type https colon double slash example.com/products. When we enter this into the browser needs to understand what each part means. HTTPS tells us the protocol we are using. Example.com is the domain name and slash products tells the server which resource or the path we are interested in. But there is an interesting problem here. We know the domain name, but the network needs an IP address to communicate with the destination. So, how does the browser find that IP address? That's where DNS come into picture. Let's look into DNS. DNS stands for Domain Name System. One simple way to think about DNS is as the Internet phone book. We remember names like example.com because they are easy for human to remember. But computer needs an IP address to communicate with the destination. So the destination system helps translate the domain name into IP address. Once the browser knows the IP address, it knows where it needs to send the request. And now we can move into next step, establishing the connection. Establishing a secure connection. In our example, we are using HTTPS. The S in HTTPS is important because it means the communication is secured by TLS. Before sensitive information is exchanged, the browser and the server establish a secure connection. This helps protect the information traveling between the browser and the server. So, when we are entering password, payment information, or other sensitive data, HTTPS is an important part of keeping that communication secure. Now that we have a secure connection, the browser can actually sense if request. Let's talk about HTTPS request. The browser now sends an HTTPS request to the server. In simple terms, the browser is saying, I need this resource. For example, we might have a GET request for slash products, but the requested domains contains more than just URL. It can contain headers, cookies, parameters, authentication information, and other metadata. The server receives that request and now has to figure out what to do with it. And that is where server side processing begins. Let's talk about server processing. This is where things can become much more interesting. The server might first validate the request, then it may execute business logic. It could request, query a database. It might call another API or an internal service, and eventually it needs to build a response for the browser. So, a simple request from our browser can actually trigger several operations behind the scene. Once the server finishes the processing, it sends a response back. So let's talk about HTTP response. The server responses contains a status code that tells us what happens. For example, 200 generally means the request was successful. A 404 means the requested resource was not found, and 500 indicates that something went wrong on the server. The response can also contain the actual content the browser needs, such as HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, and other data. But receiving the response does not mean we are finished yet. The browser still has to turn all this information into the web page that we actually see. Let's talk about browser renders the page. Now, browser takes over, it processes the HTML to understand the structure of the web page. It processes CSS to understand how that web page look like, and JavaScript can add behavior and interactivity to this. The browser may also discover that it needs additional resources, perhaps an image, a font, another JavaScript file, or data from another API. So it may make additional requests. Eventually, all these pieces come together and the browser renders the web page on our screen. Why should engineer understand this? Now, here is the important question. Why should software engineers understand this? Because when something goes wrong, the problem can exist at different points in this journey. If the web page is slow, maybe DNS is taking too long, maybe there is a network latency, maybe The backend API is slow. Maybe the database query is inefficient, or perhaps the browser itself is taking too long to render the web page. If we only understand one part of the system, we may spend time optimizing the wrong thing. Understanding the complete flow gives us much better mental model of troubleshooting this. Remember this flow. So let's put the entire journey together. We start with the URL. DNS helps us find the destination. We establish a secure connection. The browser sends an HTTP request. The server processes that request. The server sends the HTTP response. And finally, the browser processes that response and renders the web page. That's the complete journey at high level. Obviously, real world system can be much more complicated, but this gives us a strong foundation for understanding what is happening. So, next time you type URL and press enter, remember that you are starting a journey involving DNS, networking, security, servers, applications, and the browser. Something that feels like one simple action actually involves many different engineering systems working together. And I think that's one of the most valuable things about engineering fundamentals. We do not need to memorize every implementation details, but we should understand how the different pieces connect together. Because the better our mental model is, the better we can design, troubleshoot, and improve the system we build. Strong engineers do not just understand their code, they understand the journey their code takes. Thank you for watching episode number 24 of Anupam Tech Talk. Keep learning, keep building, and keep improving. I'll see you tomorrow in next episode.